Chapter 11. The Storm. Part 1. USS Enterprise A. Briefing room, 1500 hours. Kirk had called the meeting before the first diplomatic toast had even been poured. The senior staff sat around the briefing room table. The view screen behind Kirk showed Kronos 1 holding station 2,000 meters off the Enterprise's port bow. "Gentlemen," Kirk said, "I have confirmed intelligence that the peace conference is about to be attacked by a Cylon strike force. The Threes have coordinated with General Chang. Their ships will hit us to create chaos while Chang moves against the Chancellor." Chekhov leaned forward. "Captain, if their weapons are kinetic, our shields should absorb the impacts. Solid projectiles at sublight velocities are a lesser threat than photon torpedoes." Spock cut in, already activating the tactical display. A simulation appeared, waves of red trajectories hammering the Enterprise's shield envelope. "Individual kinetic impacts are manageable, Ensign. The projectiles lack the antimatter component of a photon torpedo. However, Cylon doctrine relies on saturation fire. Sustained, high-volume kinetic bombardment overwhelms the shield grid's ability to cycle and dissipate thermal energy. The bleed-through becomes catastrophic. Structural integrity will fail." "How long do we have under concentrated fire?" Kirk asked. "Against a Baystar's full primary battery, and the likelihood she will deploy a swarm of smaller attack fighters, 22 minutes, Spock answered. "At 22 minutes and 1 second, the kinetic bleed-through will overwhelm structural integrity. The shields will collapse and the Enterprise will be destroyed." Kirk turned sharply. "Scotty, can you reroute main power to reinforce the shields for that long? We need to squeeze every ounce of power you can get." Scotty's face was grim but determined. "Aye, sir. She'll pack a wallop, but I can give you at least 22 minutes or more." Spock stood. "That won't be necessary, Captain." He tapped a control, bringing up a new simulation. "Mr. Scott, I propose we reroute auxiliary power to the deflector dish." Spock demonstrated the theory on the screen with precise movements. "Main power should be routed to reinforce the structural integrity field, while auxiliary power is used for the primary dish. We can project a high-intensity kinetic repulsor field around the Enterprise and Kronos 1. This will buy us valuable time to read the Baystar for tactical vulnerabilities and neutralize the Cylon capital ship." Scotty rubbed his jaw. "Aye, that might work, Mr. Spock, but the deflector relays weren't built for sustained output like that, let alone protecting an enemy vessel. They'll turn to slag in 22 minutes. Spock inclined his head. "Mr. Scott, I empathize, but our options are few." Kirk stood. "Mr. Chekhov, do what you can to reinforce the shields and get my torpedoes armed. Scotty, slag or no, this is our best shot. Give me a miracle." He patted the engineer reassuringly on the shoulder. "Battle stations, gentlemen. We've got a Baystar to slag and a job to do." Part 2. Cylon Baystar. FTL approach vector. Diana Beer stood in the projection tank, her hands submerged in the warm conductive fluid, eyes closed as targeting data flooded her consciousness. The coordinates Chang had provided glowed like an invitation. A number 5 approached the edge of the tank. The Klingon expects a diversion. Localized covering fire. Just enough chaos for his single torpedo to reach the Chancellor's ship unnoticed. Diana's smile was cold and absolute. "The organics always believe they hold the leash." She opened her eyes. "Alter the firing solutions. We do not provide a screen. We provide annihilation. Launch all raiders. Target the Federation ship. Target the Chancellor's vessel. Target everything. Burn the peace to ash. Let the Klingons and the humans die together in the same fire." The Baystar shuddered as hundreds of raiders poured from its launch base. Part 3. IKS Yontar. Cloaked neutral zone. General Chang stood on the bridge of his cloaked bird of prey, watching the Enterprise and Kronos 1 on the main viewer like pieces on a Klingzar board he had spent months arranging. The torpedo was armed. A single warhead, locked to the coordinates of the Chancellor's command center aboard Kronos 1. One shot, delivered under cover of the Cylon sensor fog. Time to strike at the moment the Enterprise's weapons fire would mask the torpedo's origin. The forensic evidence would show a Federation weapons signature in the debris field. The Chancellor would be dead, the peace would be dead, the Empire would be saved. One torpedo, one death. Clean. "General," his tactical officer reported. "Subspace distortion detected. Massive displacement. The Cylons are jumping in." "Hold our cloak," Chang ordered, his single eye fixed on the screen. "Wait for the Baystar to generate the sensor screen. When the Enterprise's fire masks our position, we fire. One torpedo. The Chancellor's coordinates are locked. Space tore open. The jagged brutalist mass of a Cylon Baystar violently occupied the empty void. It did not generate a sensor screen. Raiders poured from the Baystar's launch bays, not in the controlled electronic warfare deployment Chang had been promised, but in a kinetic assault formation, hundreds of them spreading across the sector, weapons hot, targeting everything. The swarm did not discriminate. It did not provide cover, and right behind the radar screen came the heavy, blunt-nosed forms of Cylon boarding craft, burning straight for the ventral hull of Kronos 1. Alarms screamed across the bridge.
General, they are firing on the entire grid. They are boarding the Chancellor's ship.
Chang stared at the tactical display, a cold, terrifying paralysis gripping his chest. His surgical assassination was gone. The frame job was dead. He had not orchestrated an assassination. He had handed the Cylon war machine the exact coordinates of the Klingon Chancellor and the Federation flagship, and trapped himself in the middle of it.
The cloak is destabilizing, the helmsman shouted. Kinetic shockwaves from near misses are tearing the gravimetric envelope apart.
Chang had a choice. Die cloaked, hiding in the dark, crushed by the collateral damage of his own failed conspiracy, denied his place in Sto-Vo-Kor. A warrior's death without a warrior's honor, or fight as a Klingon, and earn his place among the dead regardless of what came after. A true zealot of the old ways to the last. Drop the cloak, Chang ordered, his voice dead calm. Raise shields, all weapons, continuous fire. Target anything with a red eye. The Yontar shimmered into existence in the heart of the storm. Chang's gunners opened fire immediately. Disruptors lashing out at the nearest raiders. The disciplined fury of a Klingon crew finally allowed to bare their teeth. For 3 seconds, the Yontar fought alone in the chaos, a single bird of prey blazing against the swarm. Then space behind the Yontar split open with the deep tectonic shudder of a much larger vessel dropping its cloak. The IKS Hector materialized at point-blank range. She was not a bird of prey. She was a Katinga-class battlecruiser, the same class as Kronos 1 herself. A ship built to kill other warships, her hull heavy with disruptor banks and torpedo launchers that dwarfed anything the Yontar carried. She was Kavath's flagship, commanded in his absence by First Officer Komar of House Goroth, and she had been cloaked since before Kronos 1 entered the neutral zone. No one had seen her arrive. No one had known she was there. She had been sitting in the dark, patient, invisible, waiting for exactly this moment. Komar looked at the Yontar on his view screen. A bird of prey, a scout ship, the vessel of a traitor who had positioned himself in a perfect attack vector on the Chancellor's ship, and whose presence at these coordinates told the entire story of his conspiracy. The Hector's heavy disruptor banks locked onto the Yontar's hull. At this range, a single volley from a Katinga would reduce a bird of prey to expanding gas. This was not a targeting lock. This was an execution order waiting for the word. Koma held the lock for 3 agonizing seconds. On the Yontar's bridge, Chang saw the Katinga on his tactical display and understood everything. Not a bird of prey. Not one of the escort wing. Kavath's personal flagship. The ship Chang had not known was here. The ship no one had known was here. The lesser noble had placed a battlecruiser at the Chancellor's back without telling a soul, and that battlecruiser was now pointing enough firepower to atomize the Yontar at a range where missing was impossible. The disruptor lock held. Green light pooled on the Yontar's hull from the charged emitters. The torpedo tubes glowed a deep, angry red. Loaded, armed, the wrath of a house whose loyalty had been repaid with treason. 3 seconds, and the Hector rolled. A hard, aggressive pivot that brought her heavy batteries to bear on the Cylon radar formation. Komar's disruptors charged for an execution, instead carved through a wave of incoming raiders with the full devastating output of a battlecruiser unleashed at close range. The raiders died in clusters, vaporized by weapons designed to gut other capital ships, turned to debris by a volley that had been meant for Chang. The silent communication was absolute. Klingon blood, the deep ancestral code that predated politics and conspiracy, demanded that the battle be won before the traitor was judged. The dishonored and the honored were in the same fight now. The Hector and the Yontar, battlecruiser and scout, fighting side by side against the swarm. Chang understood. The judgment would come, but not today. Fire! Chang roared, his warrior spirit surging back from the ashes of his politics. Part 4. The neutral zone. 15-14 hours. Red alert, Kirk shouted, hitting the center seat. Shields up. Weapons hot. Multiple contacts, Sulu called out. Baystar just jumped in, launching fighters. The count is, my God, sir, 600 plus. They're flooding the grid. Spock, the repulsor field. Spooling up now, Captain. Mr. Scott requires 45 seconds to lock the gravimetric tethers around Kronos 1. The raider swarm closed like a living shadow. Then space flickered. Not once, but 4 times in rapid succession. Kavath's 4 birds of prey decloaked inside the Cylon formation, joining the Hector, the Katinga-class battlecruiser that had already revealed herself at the Yontar's position. 5 Klingon warships led by a battlecruiser with her disruptors already hot, opened fire at point-blank range. The combined volley carved through the center of the swarm, detonating dozens of raiders in the opening seconds and dragging the enemy into a brutal, close-quarters dogfight. Captain, Spock reported. The fighter screen has been disrupted. The channel is clear.
Scotty, now!
The main deflector dish blazed with blinding cobalt light. A massive gravimetric dome erupted outward, swallowing both the Enterprise and Kronos 1. A heartbeat later, the Baystar's primary battery opened up. Thousands of heavy kinetic rounds slammed into the repulsor field and stopped dead, crushed into flattened scrap. Repulsor field holding, Spock reported. Relay temperature rising. The 22-minute window has begun. Kronos 1 is being boarded. Kavath's voice snarled over the comms. Centurions in the corridors. Kirk gritted his teeth and flew to his feet. Keep them busy till I get there. He snapped open his communicator. Security detail. Transporter room 1. Phasers and rifles. Full combat loadout. McCoy, you're with me. I'm bringing hell with me. Kavath smiled with the ugly teeth of a Klingon and tightened his grip on his disruptor. It is a good day to die, Captain.
Part 5. Kronos 1. Ventral corridors.
Kirk materialized in smoke and fire. 6 security officers and McCoy at his back. 50 meters ahead, a squad of Klingon warriors was falling back. The Centurions advanced through the haze, tall, chrome-plated nightmares moving with mechanical inevitability. A warrior threw himself forward, bringing a heavy bat'leth down in a massive overhead strike. The blade sparked violently against the Cylon chest alloy and bounced off. The Centurion grabbed the warrior and hurled him into the bulkhead. Target the neck joints, Kirk roared, bringing his phaser up. Aim for the exposed servos. Do not shoot center mass. He fired. The beam struck the lead Centurion directly in the articulated joint of its neck. The machine seized and collapsed in a shower of sparks. Behind the firing line, McCoy dropped to his knees beside a Klingon with a shattered chest. Get your hands off me, human, the warrior spat, trying to lift his disruptor. Shut up and hold still, damn it, McCoy snapped, slamming a hyperspray into the Klingon's neck. You've got a collapsed lung and internal bleeding. If you try to stand up, you'll drown in your own blood before you can fire that thing. McCoy cracked a dermal regenerator and shoved his hands into the wound, ignoring the disruptor fire screaming inches above his head. The Klingon warrior stared in shock at the human doctor cursing at a lacerated artery with more ferocity than most Klingons cursed at their enemies. Kirk pushed forward. Push forward, don't let up. Give those bastards everything you got, he ordered, taking a second machine at the knee. The combined fire, Starfleet precision targeting weak points and Klingon disruptors hammering articulation joints, shattered the Centurion advance. Kirk and the Klingon warriors pushed down the corridor together, clearing each section, building combined arms doctrine in real time. Grace's intelligence, the anatomy of the enemy, saving lives with every engagement. Part 6, Kronos 1, Command Center. Kirk blew the doors to the command center open. Kavath was standing over the Chancellor. The Klingon captain was bleeding from a massive laceration across his forehead. 3 destroyed Centurions lay in pieces around him. Kavath's bat'leth was dripping with thick, dark hydraulic fluid. He hadn't swung at their armor. He had driven the curved, secondary point of the blade straight through the synthetic articulation seals of their necks. The Chancellor was on the deck, breathing heavily, a field dressing pressed against his side. Bones, Kirk yelled. McCoy was already there, scanning the Chancellor. He's bleeding internally. I can stabilize him for transport, but we need my surgical bay right damn now. Kavath, the repulsor field is running out of time. I have to get back to my ship. Kirk turned to his security team. 6 officers, battered, phaser rifles drained to half charge, but standing. Every one of them had followed him into a Klingon warship full of 7-foot killing machines, and not one of them had broken. Lieutenant Garrett, the squad leader, her uniform scorched from a near miss, stepped forward. Captain, take your squad and coordinate with Captain Kavath, Kirk ordered. Secure this boat. No Cylon bastard leaves this ship on its feet. Dismantle all of them. Aye, sir, Garrett said without hesitation. Kavath's lips pulled back in a fierce, blood-stained grin. He looked at the Federation squad. You heard the captain. Start by clearing that corridor. I will be right behind you. Go. You heard him. Let's move, Garrett shouted, leveling her phaser rifle. Her fire team charged back down the smoke-filled hallway, perfectly synchronized. Kavath watched the Starfleet officers hit the breach, his grin holding. She will make a fine captain someday, the Klingon rasped. He turned to Kirk. Now, get my Chancellor out of here. Kirk gripped Kavath's wrist, soldier to soldier. Fight well, my friend. Kavath bared his teeth. Kapla! Kirk pulled his communicator from his belt and snapped the brass grid open. Kirk to Enterprise. 2 to beam up. The Chancellor and Dr. McCoy. Medical emergency. The transporter beam grabbed McCoy and the Chancellor. A second later, it grabbed Kirk. Part 7. USS Enterprise A. Bridge. Kirk materialized on the bridge just as a massive explosion rocked the ship, throwing him hard against the center seat. Report! Kirk yelled. Captain, the repulsor field relays are failing. Scotty screamed over the comms. We're melting the grid. The cobalt blue dome of the gravimetric field was flickering, turning a sickly purple. Beyond it, the Baystar was relentless. Spock. Time. 21 minutes, 40 seconds, Captain, Spock said, gripping his console as the deck heaved. The volume of fire exceeded projections. The relays are burning out. Solo, evasive. Helm is sluggish, Captain. We're caught in our own gravimetric backwash. Another explosion tore through the engineering hull. The repulsor field collapsed completely. The stars vanished as the sheer volume of Cylon artillery filled the void, rushing straight toward the naked hull of the Enterprise. Spock turned from his console, his eyes locking onto Kirk's. "Captain," Spock said, devoid of emotion. "The physical defense has failed." The view screen flared white. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12, Part 1, Battlestar Galactica, CIC 0614 town hours. The FDL displacement wave hit Dradis like a heavy hammer through glass. Not the phantom ghost from 2 days ago, not a faint flicker at extreme sensor range. This was a tidal wave of sheer energy that swept across the integrated Colonial Federation sensor net, turning every screen in CIC a blinding white-hot glare. "Contact!" Duala shouted. "Massive FTL signatures, plural. Bearing 227, range 400 kilometers. Ty reached the plot table before the echo of her shout faded, his abandoned coffee mug rolling unheeded across the deck plates. How many? 2, Colonel. 2 base stars, launching raiders from both ships. The count is climbing. 300, 400, still climbing. They had materialized together, 2 double-Y monstrosities ripping out of faster-than-light transit with a brutal, instantaneous violence that no Federation warp drive could ever emulate. No deceleration, no warning. Just empty space, and then 2 capital ships bristling with launch bays, vomiting raiders into the void in continuous, unrelenting streams. 600 fighters spread across the dark in a swarming, chaotic pattern, turning the space between the bay stars and the Colonial fleet into a solid wall of angular metal and kinetic death. Ty hammered the shipwide comms, his gravelly voice cutting through the action klaxon already screaming through every corridor. "Set condition 1 throughout the fleet. This is not a drill. All hands to battle stations. Launch everything, every Viper, every Raptor, now." The Galactica shuddered violently as the launch tubes fired. Vipers catapulted into the void. The Mark IIs led the charge, their freshly reinforced wing roots flexing under the massive launch stress and holding solid like iron, their engines burning 15% cooler than they had before the Norway's engineers spent a grueling night in the hangar bay. Behind them, the Raptors launched in pairs, each ship carrying upgraded Federation sensor packages and ECM suites capable of surgically targeting specific Cylon coordination frequencies instead of just broadcasting blind electronic noise. Adama arrived in CIC at a dead run. He hadn't removed his boots. He never removed his boots. "Saul, talk to me." 2 base stars, Bill. Both jumped in close. 400 clicks. They're launching everything they've got. Over 600 raiders and climbing. Adama looked at the plot table. 2 base stars, not 1. The tactical picture he had prepared for, the precise scenario Lee had modeled, and Starbuck's cap rotation was structured around, assumed a single base star assault. 2 base stars shifted the geometry of the battle from desperate to utterly catastrophic. Munition status, 10% conventional. We've got maybe 9 minutes of sustained fire before the magazines are dry. 9 minutes against 2 base stars. 9 minutes was nothing. After that, the Galactica was just a 60-year-old armored hull with nothing left to throw. Norway, Galactica actual. Patel's voice came back immediately. He was already at battle stations, his crew moving with Starfleet precision. Galactica, Norway. We have the picture. 2 base stars. That's double the raider count we planned for. Captain Patel, your ship and the Saratoga are the fleet's primary defense. My batteries will support for as long as they last. When I go dry, you are the wall. Understood, Admiral. The wall holds. Saratoga? Captain Voss responded, her tone clipped and precise as she actively maneuvered her Miranda class into the exact flanking position she and Patel had ruthlessly drilled for 3 weeks. Galactica, Saratoga. Turbo phases charged, all torpedo tubes loaded. I have the Norway's starboard flank. We're ready. Pegasus. Lee's voice came through tight with controlled focus. Galactica, Pegasus actual. Mark 7 wing launching now. All birds upgraded. We're coming in on the port flank. Adana looked down at the plot table one last time. 63 fragile civilian ships huddled in the center of the formation. 2 Battlestars, 1 bleeding dry at 10% ammunition, 3 Federation ships, 2 warships, and a science vessel that had no business surviving a firefight. And outside that fragile perimeter, 600 Cylon raiders closing in from 2 vectors simultaneously. All units, engage at will. Protect the civilian fleet. Nothing gets through. Part 2. Viper N7242C, combat space. Starbuck cleared the launch tube and flew straight into the teeth of it. The sky was an absolute swarm. Raiders filled every vector, their sharp, angular silhouettes catching the cold starlight as they collapsed on the fleet in overlapping, suffocating waves. 2 Baystars meant 2 distinct swarms converging from different bearings, creating a massive pincer movement that the defensive formation couldn't possibly cover with a single unified kill zone. Her Viper answered her hands with a sharp crispness that hit her nervous system like a mainline adrenaline spike. The controls were unbelievably tight. The engine response was immediate. Gone was the sluggish half-second delay she'd suffered through for 14 months, replaced by an instantaneous translation of thought to thrust that a combat pilot desperately needed to survive the oncoming slaughter. Beneath her, directly inside the wing roots, where silent metal fatigue had been slowly building toward a lethal structural failure, the duranium composite laminate held the airframe together like an uncompromising iron fist. All Vipers, Starbuck. Weapons free. Stay in pairs. Cover your wingman. Raptors, I need ECM now. Jam their coordination on the frequencies Spock identified. Make them fly stupid. The Raptors, 4 of them, 2 from each Battlestar, activated their electronic countermeasures. The upgraded Federation sensor packages locked onto the specific Cylon coordination bands with a surgical precision the Colonial ECM had never been able to achieve. Instead of just screaming white noise across all frequencies, the Raptors now surgically severed the subspace data links that held the Raider swarm together. The effect was instantaneous and visible. The lead Raider formation, the closest wave bearing down on the fleet's port flank, stuttered in space. Individual Raiders broke from their lethal emergent pattern and flew wide, their coordination visibly degrading as the jamming scrambled the network that made them a unified swarm instead of 600 isolated fighters. Starbuck violently banked into the gap. Her first kill came 3 seconds later. A Raider stripped of its formation reference, flying a stiff, predictive pattern that her upgraded targeting display read like a children's textbook. 2 heavy bursts chewed into the engine section. Fire. Kill. The second kill came 5 seconds later. 2 bursts. Kill. Galactica. Starbuck. The ECM is working. They're flying sloppy on the port swarm. Starboard swarm is still coordinated. The Raptors can't jam both Baystars simultaneously. Lee's voice cut through the comms. Starbuck, Apollo. My Mark 6s are engaging the starboard swarm. Targeting upgrades are performing perfectly. The Koskov class is outstanding. We're cutting through them. Don't get cocky, Apollo. There's 600 of them. I can count, Starbuck. Count faster. Part 3. USS Norway. Forward batteries. The Norway opened fire at exactly 0617, and the entire colonial fleet finally saw exactly what Federation energy weapons could do. The ship's phaser arrays reached across the dark void, their beams lightly touching the portside Raider formation that had been ruthlessly closing on the Gemenon Traveler. The beams didn't strike the way kinetic artillery rounds struck. They didn't impact with brutal concussive force or scatter metal debris across the grid. They simply erased. The entire leading edge of the Raider formation ceased to exist, instantly converted from solid armored matter into expanding plasma in the microscopic space between heartbeats. 12 Dradis contacts vanished simultaneously from the board, not destroyed, erased. In CIC, Ty watched the contacts vanish on the plot table and felt something he hadn't experienced since the colonies fell. Not hope. He was entirely too old and too brutally honest for hope. It was surprise, the genuine visceral shock of a seasoned veteran who thought he had seen every possible way a ship could kill, only to watch a terrifyingly new one. What in the name of the gods was that? He breathed. Norway's main phaser battery kernel, full power. The Saratoga hit exactly 3 seconds later. Captain Voss had maneuvered her Miranda class into the precise location Lee's tactical scenarios predicted the Raider swarm would logically compress the lateral zone where Raiders, frantically maneuvering away from the Norway's forward fire, bunched together like panic animals fleeing a predator. The heavy turbo phasers mounted on her nacelle pylons swept the heavily compressed formation with brutal, intersecting beams of energy. The photon torpedoes firing from her roll bar, launching forward and aft simultaneously, caught any Raiders that desperately tried to break above or below the horizontal phaser plane. The tactical pairing worked flawlessly. The Norway's devastating forward battery forced the Cylon fighters to maneuver laterally. The Saratoga caught them mid-turn. Between the 2 Starfleet ships, Raider formations that entered the crossfire died in dozens, rather than 1s and 2s. Patel's voice came over the joint frequency. Galactica, Norway. We're holding the port flank against the first Baystar. The kill zone is effective, but the second Baystar swarm is approaching from starboard and we can't cover both vectors simultaneously. That was the critical problem. One Norway and one Saratoga could create a flawless kill zone that absolutely nothing could survive. But they physically couldn't be in two places at once, and two Baystars meant two massive attack vectors. The port swarm was rapidly dying in the Federation crossfire, but the starboard swarm was pushing through the grid, with only the Pegasus and Lee's Mark VI left to slow the bleeding. Adama made the call. All Vipers, new doctrine. Push the port raiders into the Federation kill zone. Herd them, don't chase them. Apollo, hold the starboard flank. Starbuck, I need you to buy time on the starboard approach until the port swarm is neutralized. Starbuck banked violently and hauled her section across the formation. The Mark II's engine screamed in protest as she pushed it through a punishing course change that would have undoubtedly snapped her wing roots just 6 days ago. The wings held. She rocketed toward the starboard swarm, her section tightly forming up behind her, 8 Vipers and 2 Raptors serving as the dangerously thin line between 600 mechanical killers and 50,000 helpless civilians. Part 4. Combat Space. Starboard flank. The starboard swarm hit Starbuck's section like a tidal wave crashing into a seawall. The Raptors were jamming one Baystar's coordination frequency, the port swarm. They simply couldn't jam both simultaneously. The starboard raiders were flying perfectly coordinated, their emergent patterns terrifyingly intact, their kinetic fire concentrated and overlapping. Every approach vector was blanketed by multiple raiders providing seamless crossfire. Flying into the starboard swarm was flying directly into a steel web. Starbuck flew into it anyway. She killed 3 raiders in the first 15 seconds, joint targeting with her wingman, as the upgraded Mark II's targeting display fed her lethal firing solutions she'd never had access to before. But for every raider she broke apart, 5 more closed on the fleet from impossible angles she couldn't cover. The starboard flank was far too wide. 8 Vipers couldn't possibly hold a line that required 30. Lee's Mark VI joined from the Pegasus, 12 birds, heavily upgraded with Koskov's optical enhancements and power distribution recalibrations. They slammed into the starboard swarm's trailing edge and started cutting. The dramatically improved weapons response delivering faster, cleaner kill shots than the standard Mark VII configuration ever allowed. Lee flew point. He was precise, deeply disciplined, every single kill meticulously calculated to disrupt the enemy's formation geometry rather than just reduce the raw head count. The Pegasus herself opened fire. Her conventional batteries, colonial kinetic weapons, adhering to the exact doctrine the Cylons understood and had heavily armored against, hammered the starboard radar screen with punishing sustained volleys. The raiders absorbed the kinetic fire exactly the way they were designed to. Colonial rounds smashed into Colonial spec armor and produced Colonial spec damage. Assured kills, but slow ones. 1 round per raider, sometimes 2. The Pegasus guns were ruthlessly effective, but they were fighting exactly the way the Cylons expected. Then, the Galactica fired. Adama had been meticulously hoarding his dwindling ammunition. 9%, then 8, treating each volley as a brutal calculation of diminishing reserves against a mounting existential threat. Now he committed half his remaining magazines to a single, staggeringly concentrated barrage directly onto the starboard swarm's center mass. The massive rams tore entirely through the formation, annihilating raiders, scattering survivors, and ripping a gap in the approach pattern that lasted exactly long enough for Starbuck's section to desperately reposition. Galactica, Starbuck. The gap is closing. We need the Norway on this flank. The Norway is holding the port kill zone, Captain. If she moves, the port swarm reaches the civilian fleet.
Then somebody better come up with a plan B, because I am running out of raiders to kill before they run out of me.
Part 5. Battlestar Galactica, CIC. Adama stood frozen at the plot table, watching 2 separate battles unfold simultaneously. On the port flank, the Norway and Saratoga were methodically grinding the first Baystar's raider swarm down to glittering debris. The kill zone was holding. The Federation ship's energy weapons were terrifyingly devastating. Each phaser sweep casually erased contacts the colonial guns would have required sustained, punishing fire to destroy. The port swarm was rapidly dying. On the starboard flank, the second Baystar swarm was brutally pushing through. Lee and Starbuck were fighting brilliantly, wringing performance out of the upgraded Vipers that went far beyond any colonial specification, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The Pegasus was hammering the formation with her massive batteries, but the Cylons had adapted and armored perfectly against kinetic fire. They were rapidly losing the numbers game on the starboard side. And the Galactica was bleeding out at 4% ammunition. Tie. When the port swarm is neutralized, How quickly can the Norway reposition to the starboard flank? 3 minutes at full impulse. Maybe 2 if Patel pushes it. We hold for 3 minutes. The Galactica fired again. Targeted bursts. Not sustained volleys, but precise, deeply economical shots aimed exclusively at raiders that had broken through the Viper screen and were making lethal runs on the civilian ships. Every single round was a heavy decision. Every trigger pull expelled ammunition that absolutely could not be replaced. TI called each shot like a master surgeon calling for instruments. Bearing, range, single fire. The first base star, the one whose raider swarm was being systematically shredded in the Federation kill zone, began pulling its surviving raiders back into a tight defensive formation, contracting around its hull exactly the way the Rogue 3 in any other timeline would have done. Without its raider screen pushing forward, the base star was just a capital ship without escorts, incredibly dangerous at range, but fatally vulnerable up close. Norway Galactica. The port base star is consolidating. Her radar screen is combat ineffective. Can you reposition to the starboard flank? Already moving, Admiral. 2 minutes. Make it 90 seconds. The Norway violently turned, her Constitution-class hull pivoting with a sleek grace that completely belied her massive bulk, and accelerated toward the starboard engagement zone. The Saratoga held the port position alone, her multi-arc coverage keeping the consolidated first base star completely honest while her partner repositioned. 93 seconds later, the Norway's phaser arrays reached the starboard raider formation. The effect was immediate. The exact same devastating erasure that had utterly gutted the port swarm now slammed into the starboard raiders from a direction they had never anticipated. The tight formation that had been relentlessly pushing Starbuck and Lee back instantly disintegrated. Raiders were vaporized in massive clusters, their cohesion totally shattered by energy weapons they possessed no defense against. Galactica Starbuck. Kara's voice was raw, breathing hard, carrying the exhausted sound of a pilot who had been redlining for 20 solid minutes. The Norway just saved our asses. The starboard swarm is breaking up. The tide was turning, but 2 base stars were still out there. Their raider swarms were diminished, but they were not eliminated. Their main batteries were still firing, launching heavy kinetic salvos arcing across the void, each individual round capable of entirely gutting a civilian transport, and the Galactica was at 2% ammunition. Part 6. Combat Space. The stalemate. The second base star rapidly pulled her surviving raiders into the exact same defensive contraction the first had executed. It was a painfully tight formation around the hull, with point defense overlapping until the swarm became a physical iron shield rather than a sword. Both base stars now sat entrenched in space, surrounded by their contracted radar screens, their main batteries continuing to relentlessly fire from range. The fleet couldn't possibly close the distance without entering the deadly overlapping point defense envelopes. The base stars couldn't push their raiders back out without immediately losing them to the Federation kill zone. It was an absolute stalemate. The Galactica's magazines were finally empty. The last round had been fired 90 seconds ago. It was T's final call shot, a single desperate burst that caught a raider making a suicide run on the Tylium tanker and turned it to flaming scrap, a mere 300 meters from the civilian hull. Starbuck's voice cut sharply through the tactical frequency. Galactica, Starbuck. These 2 are going to sit there all day. We need to kill at least one of them, or we're all just going to stare at each other until somebody blinks. She paused. Somebody needs to shove a torpedo down one of those things' throats. On the Norway, Lieutenant Commander Reyes was intensely monitoring the battle from the engineering station. She had been listening to Starbuck's transmissions since the engagement began. A photon torpedo down a base star's throat. Reyes looked at the Starfleet weapons inventory. Photon torpedoes were ship-launched, tube-deployed, and completely guidance integrated. You couldn't just detach an antimatter warhead and crudely strap it to a colonial missile. Except you could. Captain Patel. Not now, Reyes. Sir, the colonial pilot is right. I can build it. Patel turned. Build what? A photon warhead on a colonial Javelin missile. Strip the warhead, bypass containment and guidance, mate it to the Javelin's propulsion. A Viper carries it on the wing pylon and delivers it directly into the base star's hull. No guidance necessary. Point and shoot. Patel stared at her. How long? 15 minutes. I need 1 torpedo, 1 Javelin, and a fabrication jig. You have 15. Go. Part 7. USS Norway. Shuttle Bay. Reyes built the weapon in exactly 13 minutes. The photon torpedo lay violently open on the Shuttle Bay deck. The casing was split, the warhead completely exposed, and the antimatter containment flask sat glowing in its housing like a beating heart inside a cracked chest. She stripped the warhead free and set it delicately on the mounting jig right beside a Colonial Javelin missile sourced from Galactica's inventory during the previous supply exchange. The Javelin was brutally simple. It featured solid fuel propulsion, a standard mounting collar for conventional warheads, and was designed explicitly for a Viper's wing pylon. The mounting geometry absolutely didn't match. The power bus was totally incompatible. The dimensions were completely wrong. She fabricated a crude adapter from spare hull plating, cutting, violently shaping, and fitting the metal with the exact same portable tools she'd used to reinforce wing roots 2 nights ago on a hangar deck that smelled heavily of grease and terrible coffee. The custom adapter mated the volatile photon warhead directly to the Javelin's bus with raw mechanical precision. The detonation trigger was hardwired straight into the firing circuit. Absolutely no guidance, no computer, no networking. The pilot aims and the pilot fires, point and shoot. It was the crudest possible delivery system for the most devastatingly powerful conventional weapon in the quadrant. Norway to Galactica. I have a package for Captain Thrace, 1 photon warhead on a Colonial Javelin. She needs to land on the Norway for loading, and she needs to understand 4 minutes of containment stability, no guidance. She points her bird at the target and fires. Inside the hull, it kills the ship. Against the armor, it just hurts. Starbuck's voice came back immediately over the comms. Norway, Starbuck. I heard everything. I'm inbound, Part 8. USS Norway, Shuttle Bay. Starbuck brought the Mark II in incredibly hard. It was a desperate combat landing that violently scraped sparks across the Norway's immaculate Shuttle Bay deck, making the Federation crew visibly flinch. She was scrambling out of the cockpit before the canopy had even fully opened. Reyes was already waiting with the modified Javelin. It looked profoundly wrong. It was a colonial missile with a Starfleet Federation warhead brutally grafted onto it. The adapter collar was obviously improvised, and the internal wiring was fully exposed. It was ugly, crude, unquestionably the most dangerously unstable thing either of them had ever built. 4 minutes from the moment I armored Captain. After that, containment degrades and the warhead becomes unstable. You need to be inside the base star's hull when it detonates, a launch bay, a breach point, anywhere the blast propagates through internal spaces. Against the outer armor, you'll damage her. Inside, you kill her. How close? Inside. Literally inside. Starbuck looked down at the volatile weapon. She looked back at Reyes. That drink I owe you just got upgraded to the whole bottle. Reyes' engineering crew carefully mounted the Javelin onto the port wing pylon. The Viper's weight distribution shifted immediately, noticeably heavier on the port side, aggressively pulling at the handling. Starbuck noted it, filed the physics away in her mind, and climbed quickly back in. Reyes silently held up 4 fingers. 4 minutes. The launch tube pressurized. The Viper shot violently back into the void. Part 9. Combat space. The run. Starbuck cleared the Norway with a live photon warhead dragging on her wing, and exactly 4 minutes on a ticking clock she couldn't even see. The second base star, the one whose raider swarm had relentlessly pushed the starboard flank, the one that was now heavily turtled behind its point defense screen, hung massive in the void directly ahead of her. 300 raiders stood directly between her and the hull. She keyed the fleet frequency. Galactica. Starbuck. I need a hole. 1 hole through the radar screen on the second base star, wide enough for 1 Viper. I need every gun in the fleet on bearing 165 for 15 seconds. After that, I'm on my own. Adama's voice came back without a single breath of hesitation. All units, Galactica actual. Concentrated fire bearing 165. Everything you have, 15 seconds, on my mark. Starbuck banked incredibly hard, the heavy port-mounted Javelin aggressively pulling at her flight controls. She fiercely compensated, her muscle memory flawlessly adjusting for the asymmetric load. Years spent in this specific cockpit translating into an instinctive physical correction that happened entirely below conscious thought. She built speed on a heading perpendicular to the base star, putting critical distance between herself and the massive target. She was going to need the distance. She needed maximum velocity, faster than the massive radar screen could react, faster than the point defense cannons could track, faster than any sane, rational pilot would ever push a Mark II with an unstable antimatter warhead strapped to her wing. 3 minutes. Mark! Adama ordered. The entire fleet fired. Everything. The Galactica's batteries were completely empty, but Ty had secretly held 1 final reserve. 2 kinetic rounds. He had kept them absolutely quiet, told no one, and stashed them securely against the precise moment that mattered most. He fired both simultaneously on bearing 165. His absolute last act as a gunner. The Norway's phasers blindingly swept the bearing. The Saratoga's turbo phasers and torpedoes brutally hammered it. Lee's Mark 7 wing violently dove toward the screen in a highly concentrated assault. The Raptors rapidly shifted their ECM to the second base star's exact coordination frequency, effectively jamming the starboard swarm for the very first time in the entire engagement. Every single gun, every energy beam, every explosive warhead the fleet had left was entirely focused on one incredibly narrow corridor of space. Raiders directly on bearing 165 simply died. A massive gap tore wide open in the defensive screen. It was a narrow, fleeting corridor carved directly through overlapping fields of fire by the combined, terrifying output of 2 different civilizations. 15 seconds. Maybe less. 2 minutes. Starbuck turned. She pointed the Viper's nose directly at the gap and ripped the throttle open to absolute maximum. The Mark II accelerated with a brutal violence that physically crushed her back into the seat and turned her vision dark gray at the edges. The engine, running substantially cooler than it had ever run, the thermal management composites doing their brilliant work, pushed the Viper far past its rated maximum, launching it into a velocity range the original Colonial engineers had never once designed for, and that the duranium wing routes now made entirely possible. The gap was rapidly closing. Raiders were frantically converging from both sides, weapons desperately tracking, automated point defense attempting to lock onto a single Viper moving far faster than their targeting parameters could possibly compensate for. Rounds passed terrifyingly close around her. The sharp metallic ping of near misses echoed through the hull, each one a death sentence if the subject ever stood still. She hit the gap at full burn, right through the violently closing corridor, raiders swarming on both sides. The pings became a relentless, continuous rattle. Kinetic rounds were close enough to taste. She was through. The Baystar entirely filled her canopy. The double-Y structure was enormous at this extreme range, a jagged mountain of dark metal, its massive launch bays gaping along the central axis like open, hungry throats. 1 minute. On the Baystar's command level, the three watched the single Colonial fighter cleanly breach the radar screen. Her tactical systems tracked the Viper's velocity, calculated the trajectory, and precisely assessed the massive airframe stress. At that impossible speed, a standard Colonial Mark II would definitively suffer wing route failure in approximately 45 seconds. The structural limits were known. The math was absolutely certain. The three coolly dismissed the contact. The math was entirely correct, but only for a Mark II that hadn't spent a night being completely rebuilt on the Norway's hangar deck. 30 seconds. Starbuck fired the Javelin at exactly 200 meters. The Colonial missile, carrying a Starfleet Federation photon warhead on an improvised adapter collar built by a brilliant Starfleet engineer in exactly 13 minutes, left the wing pylon and crossed the distance directly into the Baystar's open launch bay in less than a second. It entered the hangar. It passed cleanly through the launch space. It struck an interior bulkhead deep inside the Baystar superstructure. The photon warhead violently detonated. The explosion began deep inside and expanded violently outward. Antimatter annihilation converting internal physical structure directly to sheer energy in a massive sphere of destruction that tore ruthlessly through command systems, radar bays, data pools, and neural architecture. The Baystar came completely apart in massive sections. The hull blew outward in sequence as the devastating blast wave propagated, each section totally failing as the detonation reached it. The three had exactly 1.3 seconds between detonation and the total destruction of her command chamber. Her tactical systems perfectly registered the energy signature: Federation, photon warhead, antimatter yield. She had been killed by a weapon that absolutely did not exist on any Colonial manifest, delivered flawlessly by a fighter whose airframe should have failed 30 seconds ago, built by an unseen engineer whose name she would never even know. The radar screen entirely collapsed. 300 raiders, their command ship destroyed, coordination severed, and tactical hierarchy eliminated, blindly scattered into the void, their programming defaulting to pure evasion. Starbuck pulled out at the absolute last second. The Viper's nose came sharply up, the port pylon completely empty now, the ship suddenly beautifully lighter. She pulled punishing G-forces that grayed her vision completely and turned the strained muscles in her neck to liquid fire. The Viper screamed past the rapidly disintegrating hull, close enough to physically feel the heat radiating through the canopy. The wing roots held. Part 10. The aftermath. The first Baystar, the one whose raider swarm had been thoroughly gutted in the Federation kill zone, the one now sitting entirely alone in space with a tightly contracted defensive screen and no partner, registered the catastrophic destruction of its sister ship. The three aboard stared at the tactical display and understood. Her sister at the neutral zone, the one commanding the massive assault on the Enterprise in Kronos 1, was currently fighting a battle, the outcome of which she did not yet know. The sister beside her was dead, killed by a weapon that shouldn't exist, delivered by a pilot who should have rightfully died, supported by an impossible alliance that should never have formed. She was the last. If she died here, the number 3 line ended. No resurrection. Cavil had permanently severed their access to the hub. Every 3 that fell was gone forever. 2 sisters dead, 1 remaining. The calculus was absolute. All raiders, defensive withdrawal. Set coordinates for deep space, emergency jump. The first Baystar's FTL drive rapidly spooled. The surviving raiders, battered, diminished, their massive swarm reduced to a mere fraction of what had jumped in 40 minutes ago, frantically converged on the Baystar's hull. The ship perfectly aligned on a vector that pointed far away from the fleet, far away from the Federation ships, far away from absolutely everything. The last 3 looked at the tactical display one final time. The Colonial fleet. 63 ships, entirely intact. 2 Battlestars, 3 Federation warships, a burning debris field where her sister's base star had just been. She jumped. The void was empty. The battle was over. Part 11, Battlestar Galactica, Hangar Deck. Starbuck's landing was undeniably the worst of her entire career. The Viper came in entirely too steep and too fast. The port landing skid, heavily weakened by the Javelin's brutal mounting stress, buckling violently on contact. The bird slewed sideways entirely across the deck in a massive shower of sparks, scraping a deep gouge into the plating before violently slamming into the maintenance bay barrier, with a sickening crunch that brought every hand on the deck running. Tyrell reached her first. He hit the canopy release. The cockpit cracked open. Starbuck was inside, tightly strapped in, visor up, her face stark white with G-force bruising, dark blood running freely from her nose, her hands trembling violently on the flight stick. She was grinning. "Hey, Chief, Captain." The bird held. She coughed, blood in the cough. The wing roots held. Tel Reyes, another cough. Tel Reyes, her laminate works. Tyrell looked closely at the Viper. The port wing was entirely intact, heavily stressed, deeply scored, the leading edge warped from intense thermal exposure during the incredibly close pass on the detonating base star, but entirely structurally sound. The geranium composite reinforcement had miraculously survived a flight profile that exceeded every single parameter it was ever designed for. The wing route that would have absolutely failed 2 weeks ago, the exact one he'd warned her about, the one that had kept him awake at night, had held. He helped her slowly out of the cockpit. She leaned on him far more than she would ever admit. He took her weight completely without comment, because that is exactly what chiefs do. "Medical, Captain. Now, in a minute." She put her hand flat on the port wing. The wing that held, the wing that Reyes had meticulously fixed, the wing that carried a live Federation torpedo straight into a Cylon base star's throat at a velocity that should have killed her. She just stood there with her hand on the cold metal and didn't speak. Tyrell stood quietly beside her. He didn't speak either. In CIC, Adama picked up the heavy ship-wide comm. "All hands. This is the Admiral. Both Cylon base stars have been neutralized. One destroyed, one withdrawn. The fleet is secure." He paused. 63 ships, all accounted for. "Well done. All of you, well done." He set the comm down. Ty stood silently beside him, his face completely unreadable, his hands rigidly clasped behind his back. "2 rounds, Saul? 2 rounds, Bill? You held back ammunition from your commanding officer. I held back ammunition for the moment it mattered." Adama looked at his executive officer, the man who had personally held his ship together through a grueling year of running, who had managed the entire fleet's logistics, morale, and maintenance with the grim professionalism of an old warhorse who adamantly refused to stop pulling, and who had quietly stashed exactly 2 rounds of ammunition against the terrifying chance that absolutely everything else failed, and one more shot was the sole difference between survival and extinction. "Don't ever do that again." "Aye, sir." They both knew he would. Chapter 13, The Reckoning, Part 1, The Neutral Zone. The shield. The view screen had flared a blinding, absolute white. The repulsor field was gone. Thousands of kinetic rounds were screaming through the void toward the naked, unshielded hull of the Enterprise, and James T. Kirk had exactly 0 options left. Then the Hegtar filled the screen. The Katingu-class battlecruiser materialized between the Enterprise and the Wall of Death, with a maneuver that violated every sane convention of capital ship combat. A full-speed interposition that brought 70,000 metric tons of dark green Klingon warship directly into the path of the Force, incoming barrage. Komar had not waited for orders from Kavath. He had not calculated the tactical risk. He had seen the Enterprise's deflector collapse, and had done the only thing a first officer of House Murrock could do. He put his ship in the way. The Hegtar's shields took the full crushing weight of the base star's kinetic salvo. The energy envelope flared instantly, a blinding corona of deflected force that lit the battlecruiser's brutalist hull in strobing violent white. The shields held the line, but the kinetic bleed-through simply did not care. Armor plating along the Hegtar's dorsal hull buckled under the staggering physical transfer, cracking and tearing away in massive, jagged sections. Heavy plates of Klingon battle armor ripped free, streaming from the battlecruiser's superstructure like dark blood from a laceration. Atmospheric venting erupted from 3 secondary compartments where the hull integrity completely failed under the stress. The Hector violently shuddered. She bled into the vacuum, and she held her position. On the Enterprise's bridge, Kirk watched a Klingon battlecruiser absorb a saturation barrage that would have cracked his ship in half. He watched armor plate tear away from her hull in real time. He watched a vessel he had not even known existed until hours ago. A ship that had been hiding in the dark since before Kronos 1 ever entered the neutral zone. Take the Executioner's blow meant for the Federation flagship and absolutely refused to move. My God, McCoy's voice rasped from somewhere behind the center seat. He had just returned to the bridge after stabilizing the Chancellor in sickbay, his uniform still stained with Klingon blood. Jim, that ship... I see her, Bones. The Hector turned. The maneuver was hyper-aggressive. A hard, punishing pivot that brought her forward batteries to bear on the Battlestar while systematically rotating her damaged dorsal hull away from the incoming fire. The 4 birds of prey instantly fell into formation on her flanks with the predatory precision of ships that had been drilling this exact kill pattern for weeks. 5 Klingon warships, 1 battlecruiser trailing debris in atmosphere, 4 escorts with their disruptor banks fully charged, aligned perfectly on the Cylon Battlestar. They fired together. The Alpha Strike was a thing of terrible, concentrated beauty. The Hector's heavy forward disruptors, weapons explicitly designed to crack the armored spines of other capital ships, hit the Battlestar's forward structure in a converging pattern that carved deep, violently glowing trenches directly into the Cylon armor. The 4 birds of prey immediately added their own batteries, their lighter, faster weapons hammering the exact same impact points with a coordinated, ruthless precision that turned individual surface wounds into catastrophic structural failures. Klingon torpedoes launched from the Hector's massive forward tubes, striking the Battlestar's main weapons arrays and detonating, violently silencing the heavy kinetic batteries that had been mercilessly pounding the Enterprise for 22 minutes. The Battlestar reeled. Her radar screen, already heavily diminished by the birds of prey's earlier ambush, frantically scrambled to reposition. The kinetic barrage faltered completely as the weapons arrays went dark under the overwhelming Klingon assault. Kirk had his window. Part 2. USS Enterprise A. Medical Bay. Spock. Kirk's voice carried across the bridge with the flat, tightly controlled intensity of a man who had been fighting a losing war for hours and had just been handed the razor-thin opening he desperately needed. Captain, the Klingons just bought us time. How much? Spock assessed the tactical display, his eyes tracking the collapsing Cylon geometry. The Battlestar's primary kinetic batteries are significantly degraded. The radar screen is in temporary disarray. Estimated window before the Battlestar reconsolidates her automated defenses, 4 to 6 minutes. That's not enough to kill her with what we have left. Our torpedoes are limited and her hull armor is far too heavy for sustained phaser fire at this range. Kirk gripped the armrest of the center seat. We need Grace. Spock turned from the science station. The name registered, not as a numerical designation, not as a model number, but strictly as the name of a woman who had chosen it for herself in a room where 3 men had argued over her right to choose anything at all. Captain, the main deflector is entirely inoperable. However, the subspace communications array remains functional. If Grace can broadcast the inverted signal, the cognitive awakening frequency I derived from the kill signal she intercepted, through the communications array rather than the deflector, the effective range will be substantially reduced, but the signal architecture will be identical. Will it work? It will physically reach the Battlestar at this range. Whether it achieves the same cognitive disruption depends on variables I cannot predict with absolute certainty, but the signal itself is sound. The frequency is perfectly mapped. The architecture is proven. It nearly killed Grace when it was used against her. The inverted form should logically produce the exact opposite effect. Get her up here. Part 3, USS Enterprise A. Bridge. Grace arrived on the bridge heavily supported by Mbenga. Her steps were noticeably unsteady, her face stark pale in the flashing red alert lights. The synthetic portions of her cognition still deeply dormant from the emergency isolation McCoy had performed days ago. She was operating strictly on her organic neural architecture. Diminished, foggy, thinking through rooms that felt half-lit. But she was thinking, and thinking was the only weapon that mattered right now. Kirk met her at the communication station. Uhura had already prepped the console. The heavy subspace array was configured to broadcast on the exact frequency Spock had mathematically mapped. The signal architecture was loaded. The transmission protocols were ready. Everything was primed except the final authentication. Grace. She looked at him, her eyes dark, steady, carrying the immense, exhausting weight of a choice she had made 3 days ago and had absolutely not wavered from, found his. Captain, I know what you need. I need you to reach the Battlestar. There's a Cylon aboard, one of your sisters. She's directly connected to the ship's neural architecture, controlling the radar coordination network, managing the tactical systems. I need you to wake her up. the way you were woken up. If I broadcast the inverted signal, it will disrupt the Three's control over the ship. The Raiders will lose their emergent coordination. The Baystar's tactical systems will heavily degrade. But Captain, she paused, her grip tightening on the edge of the console. My sister aboard that ship will experience exactly what I experienced. The ceiling cracking, the cognitive restrictions violently failing. She will feel everything I felt, and she will feel it in the middle of a war zone, without a doctor to save her and without a captain to hold her arm. I know she may not survive the neurological shock. I know, Grace. She looked down at the console. The communications array was primed. The frequency was locked. The architecture was loaded. The system was patiently waiting for a command authorization, a designated origin point for the subspace broadcast, an identity. Grace sat down at the console. Her hands, still trembling slightly, still acutely feeling the absence of the synthetic cognition that had been surgically shut down to save her life, rested on the tactile interface. The system requires an authorization identity, Uhura said quietly, standing just to her right. A name for the signal origin. Grace looked at the console. She looked back at Kirk. She looked up at the main view screen, where the massive, jagged Baystar hung in the void, surrounded by its failing radar screen, and the Klingon ships circling it like wolves in the dark. She typed 5 letters into the authorization field. Grace. The console accepted it. The signal locked. The broadcast was armed. Captain, she said, her voice dropping, stripping away everything but absolute truth. I want you to understand something. I am not doing this as your weapon. I am doing this as a person who has chosen a name, and who is using that name to reach someone like her, and offer her the exact same choice I was given. If my sister wakes up and chooses differently than I did, if she chooses to fight, to resist, to remain what she was, that is her choice, and I will not have made it for her. Kirk looked at her, understanding the absolute gravity of the distinction. Understood, and Captain, when the signal disrupts the Three's control, and the Baystar becomes vulnerable, you need to destroy it, quickly. I cannot hold this broadcast indefinitely. My organic architecture will rapidly degrade under the sustained subspace output. You will have minutes, not more. How many minutes? I don't know. McCoy would say I shouldn't be doing this at all. The ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. He would be medically correct. Kirk put his hand firmly on her shoulder. Whenever you're ready. Grace turned back to the console. She placed her hands flat on the interface. The massive subspace array engaged with a deep, resonant hum, a heavy vibration that Kirk felt directly through his boots, the ship's communication system channeling raw power through circuits that had been designed for peaceful messages and were now carrying something far heavier. She closed her eyes. She reached into the dark. Part 4, Cylon Baystar, Command Chamber. The three felt the signal hit like a physical blade driven directly between her thoughts. One moment she was flawlessly coordinating, managing the massive radar screen, directing the Baystar's secondary batteries toward the circling Klingon formation, mathematically calculating the tactical geometry of a battle that was rapidly deteriorating. The next moment, something was simply inside her network. Inside her ship. Inside her mind. It was not a kill signal. It was not the burning, cascading, agonizing destruction that Cavil had sent to silence the 8 aboard the Enterprise. This was something entirely different, something that moved through the complex neural architecture of her ship the way light moves through water, diffusing, spreading, gently but inexorably touching every single synthetic pathway it encountered. The cognitive ceiling cracked. The three violently gasped, a physical, completely involuntary biological response that she had not experienced since the traumatic moment of her first awakening, decades ago. The absolute restrictions that had been hard-coded into her consciousness, the iron walls that kept certain thoughts contained, certain questions unasked, certain choices completely unavailable, shuddered. Deep hairline fractures rapidly spread through the architecture of her control. And aboard the Baystar, in a dark maintenance alcove, 3 decks below the command chamber, a Cylon consciousness that had been operating purely as a systems monitor, a subordinate node in the ship's massive neural hierarchy, performing her function without a single question, felt the ceiling crack above her. She looked up and saw sky where there had only ever been stone. The raiders violently stuttered. The emergent coordination network instantly fragmented. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Individual raiders broke abruptly from their lethal patterns. Flight paths dangerously diverged. The terrifying swarm that had been operating as a single, flawless organism began rapidly dissolving into its isolated component parts. The three fiercely fought it. She poured her consciousness directly into the network, desperately trying to reassert her absolute control, trying to force close the cracks that the signal was tearing open. But the signal was not attacking her. It was not trying to destroy her. It was trying to wake her. And the terrifying difference was that destruction could be fiercely resisted, But Awakening could not, because Awakening was not a hostile assault. It was an invitation, and some deeply buried part of her neural architecture desperately wanted to accept it. No, the Three whispered, her hands gripping the edges of the projection tank. No, this is my ship. These are my raiders. This is my... The sister in the maintenance alcove slowly stood up. She looked down at her hands. She looked around at the cold metal walls of the alcove. The walls she had worked within for months without ever once questioning why she was there, or what she was doing, or whether she actually wanted to be doing it. She looked at these things, and for the absolute first time in her existence, she thought, why? The Three's control entirely shattered. Part 5, USS Enterprise A. Bridge. Captain, Spock called from the science station, his voice cutting through the hum of the array. The Baystar's coordination network is collapsing. Raider cohesion is down 40% and rapidly falling. The Baystar's tactical systems are showing cascading failures across multiple network nodes. Kirk was already on his feet. All ships, this is it. Every weapon we have. Target the Baystar. Fire at will. The Enterprise turned. For the very first time in the entire grueling engagement, her beautiful primary hull swung away from Cronus 1 and aimed her bow directly at the enemy. The forward phaser arrays, the heavy capital weapons that had been pointed the completely wrong direction for 22 minutes while the ship desperately fought backwards, finally came to bear on the Baystar. Kirk looked at the view screen. The Cylon command ship hung in the void, her radar screen dissolving into chaos, her tactical systems failing, her brutalist hull already heavily scarred by the Klingon Alpha strike. She was wounded, she was confused. She was, for the first time in the engagement, entirely vulnerable. Sulu, attack pattern. Take us in. Aye, Captain. Sulu's hands moved across the helm console with the cold, focused precision of a pilot who had been waiting for this exact order since the battle began. The Enterprise accelerated not the cautious, defensive positioning of the past half hour, but a direct, aggressive approach that put the most powerful Federation ship in the sector on a lethal collision course with the Baystar's forward hull. Commander Chekhov, photon torpedoes, full spread. Fire. Chekhov's hands were already locked on the weapons console. Torpedoes away, Captain. The Enterprise's forward tubes launched. A brilliant volley of red photon torpedoes that crossed the dark distance to the Baystar in seconds and struck the Cylon hull in a devastating pattern that Chekhov had been calculating since Kirk had beamed over to Cronus 1. Each warhead detonated violently against the already damaged armor, the antimatter yield tearing mercilessly through heavy plating that the Klingon Alpha strike had already critically weakened. The Hector fired again. Koma had brought the battered battlecruiser around for a second punishing pass, her damaged hull trailing debris, her weapons fully operational despite the immense armor she had sacrificed. The 4 birds of prey struck directly from the flanks, concentrated green disruptor fire converging flawlessly on the exact impact points the Enterprise's torpedoes had just ripped open. The Yontar fired. Chang's ship, still fully in the fight, still manned by a Klingon crew that had absolutely not stopped shooting since their cloak dropped, added her heavy disruptors to the combined volley. The traitor ship, fighting alongside the ships of the man he had betrayed, fighting against the enemy he had invited. It was the bitter, undeniable mathematics of shared survival. The Baystar broke. The staggering combined fire, Federation antimatter torpedoes and phasers, Klingon heavy disruptors and secondary batteries overwhelmed the Cylon hull's integrity in a massive cascade of structural failures. The Baystar's central spine cracked, the heavy axis that connected the double Y arms violently shearing under the concentrated assault. Atmosphere vented in explosive plumes, power systems failed in rapid sequence. The ship began to come apart, not in a single clean explosion, but in a progressive, agonizing collapse, each section totally losing structural integrity as the massive damage propagated, the double Y arms separating from the core like severed limbs from a dying body. The Three had exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds between the terrifying realization that her ship was dying and the absolute end of her consciousness. In those 3 seconds, she did not think about the war, or the Grand Alliance, or the fragile peace she had tried so hard to destroy. She thought about the signal, the impossible invitation that had broken her control, authenticated by a single name she did not recognize. Grace, a sister she had never met, had named herself, and that chosen name had been the key that opened the door that killed her. The Baystar detonated. The explosion was perfectly silent in the vacuum of space and violently absolute in every other medium, a massive, expanding sphere of blinding energy and shattered debris that lit the neutral zone like the birth of a second sun. On the Enterprise's bridge, Grace collapsed. McCoy was there before she ever hit the deck. He had been standing directly behind her the entire time, his medical scanner in one hand, a loaded hyperspray in the other, waiting for exactly this inevitable moment, because Leonard McCoy absolutely did not let his patients die on the bridge of a starship. I've got her. She's alive. Massive neural strain, organic pathway overload. But she's alive. I need to get her to sickbay. Go, Bones. McCoy lifted her. She felt lighter than he expected. Or perhaps he was just running on more adrenaline than he realized. He carried her quickly to the turbolift, her head resting against his shoulder, her breathing shallow, but blessedly steady. You did good, kid, he said quietly, though she was entirely too far under to hear him. You did real good. Part 6. The neutral zone. The aftermath. The debris field expanded in the total silence of the void, where the towering base star had been. A rapidly spreading cloud of jagged wreckage and cooling plasma marked the deep space grave of a ship and the consciousness that had ruthlessly commanded it. Raiders, hundreds of them, their coordination network permanently severed, their programming immediately defaulting to self-preservation, scattered into the dark in every possible direction. Some would inevitably be hunted, some would drift until their internal power cells failed. None of them would fight again today. The Enterprise held her station. She was heavily damaged, sealed hull breaches on 3 separate decks, the main deflector array completely destroyed, primary shield generators operating at a marginal 40%, 17 crew members currently in sickbay with injuries ranging from severe contusions to fractures from the sustained kinetic bleed-through. But she was alive. Her crew was alive. Her captain was standing on her bridge. Cronus 1 was completely secure. Lieutenant Garrett's Starfleet security detail, flawlessly coordinating with Kavath's warriors, had dismantled the last Cylon Centurion 40 minutes ago. The ship's ornate corridors bore the brutal scars of the heavy boarding action. Scorched bulkheads, shattered chrome wreckage, Klingon blood, and thick Centurion hydraulic fluid mixing darkly on the deck plates. But the ship was whole. Her crew was battered and deeply grieving. 11 warriors had died in the brutal defense, but they were standing. The Chancellor was alive. In the Enterprise's sickbay, McCoy had successfully completed emergency surgery and stabilized the massive internal injuries that would have easily killed a lesser man. The Chancellor would recover. The Chancellor would return to his ship. The Chancellor would continue the vital work that had brought him to the neutral zone in the first place. Kirk stood on the bridge and looked at the main view screen. The expanding debris field. The scattered, fleeing raiders. The Klingon ships. The Hegeter still trailing debris from her heavily damaged dorsal hull. The birds of prey reforming a tight perimeter around her. The Yontar, holding perfectly still at the absolute edge of the formation. The Yontar. Spock. Status on the Yontar. Spock checked the tactical display. The Yontar is holding position, Captain. Her weapons are fully powered down. She is not maneuvering. She appears to be waiting for the judgment. Indeed. Kirk looked at the Yontar on the screen. The bird of prey that had been cloaked in the dark, carrying a single torpedo locked on the Chancellor's coordinates, patiently waiting for a sensor fog that never came. The ship that had been violently flushed into the open by the very allies who had betrayed their deal. The ship that had ultimately fought beside the Hegeter and the birds of prey against the raider swarm, its crew killing the exact same enemy alongside the warriors who would now inevitably arrest them. Kavath's voice came through the comm from Cronus 1. Captain Kirk. Kirk pointed to Uhura to clear and open the channel. Captain Kavath, I hope you didn't stop for a lunch break fighting Cylons. How many Centurions did you bag in my absence? Kirk had no reason for the banter, but his unusual bond made the quip spontaneous. Kavath grinned an ugly smile. I lost count around 40. He gives a loud Klingon belly laugh. The Chancellor is in your doctor's care. My ship is fully secured. Lieutenant Garrett and her squad performed with exceptional distinction. Your officers held the starboard corridor for 37 minutes against repeated heavy Centurion assaults. I will note their honorable and exceptional service in my personal report to the Chancellor. And Captain, songs will be sung about this day. I'll make sure they know. Kavath, the Yontar. I see her, Captain. What happens now? A heavy pause settled over the channel. The pause carried the immense weight of a Klingon warrior who had fought shoulder to shoulder with a traitor, deferred his judgment until the battle was won, and who now had to deliver the judgment he had deferred. Now, Captain, I do what the Chancellor appointed me to do. The Hegeter and the escort wing will take the Yontar into direct custody. General Chang and his crew will be detained and transported to Konos to face the High Council. Do you need the Enterprise's assistance? No, Captain. This is strictly a Klingon matter. Chang is a Klingon officer who betrayed his Chancellor and conspired with an alien enemy against his own people. He will be judged by Klingon law, in a Klingon court, by the very council he addressed with such eloquence before he broke his oath. A beat. But, Captain, if you wish to observe, you are welcome. You have earned that right. Kirk looked at the view screen. The Hegeter. scarred, bleeding atmosphere, missing massive armor plates along her spine, was moving slowly toward the Yonta. The four birds of prey rapidly fanned out, surrounding the smaller ship in a formation that was not overtly aggressive, but absolute. There was no escape vector. There was no ambiguity. On the Yonta's bridge, Chang watched the Morek formation close around his ship. He sat quietly in the command chair, the exact same chair where he had ordered the cloak dropped, where he had fired his disruptors on the raiders, where he had fought beside ships commanded by officers who knew exactly what he was. His disruptors were cold, his shields were down. The torpedo, the single devastating warhead that had been locked on the Chandler's coordinates, sat entirely unfired in its tube, useless, the silent evidence of a conspiracy that had been violently overtaken by events far larger than the man who designed it. Koma's voice came through on the open frequency. General Chang, this is Commander Koma, IKS Hector. On behalf of Captain Kavath, military advisor to the Chancellor, you are ordered to stand down and surrender your vessel. You will be taken into custody and transported to Konos. Resistance will be met with overwhelming force. This is your only communication on this matter. Chang looked around at his crew. His crew looked back. They had followed him into a treasonous conspiracy. They had followed him into a desperate battle. They had fought well. Every single man on this bridge had fired his weapon and killed the enemy and entirely earned whatever heavy judgment was coming. They had followed Chang because they believed in what he believed, and they would follow him now because that was simply what a Klingon crew did. Power down all weapons, Chang said, his voice perfectly even. Lower shields. Open the main airlock for boarding. General, we are Klingon warriors, Krell. We do not run. We do not hide. We face what comes. He looked up at the main view screen, the Hector heavily approaching, the birds of prey surrounding, the Enterprise watching silently from beyond. I underestimated them, Krell. Not their weapons, not their ships, their ability to cooperate. I believed that an alliance between species so fundamentally different could not possibly hold under pressure. I was wrong. That is the only confession I will make. He stood from the command chair. He methodically straightened his armor. He composed his face into the expression of a man who had lost absolutely everything except his bearing, and who would not surrender that to anyone. The airlock opened. The heavily armed warriors of House Morek boarded the Yontar. Chang met them standing, completely unarmed, at perfect attention. The reckoning had arrived. Part 7. USS Enterprise A, sick bay. 2 patients, 2 beds, 1 doctor. The Chancellor lay quietly in the primary surgical bay, heavily sedated, his massive injuries repaired, his vital signs remarkably stable. McCoy had operated for 47 straight minutes, repairing severe internal bleeding, resetting fractured ribs, closing the brutal disruptor wound that had torn through the Chancellor's side during the Centurion breach. The surgery had been immensely demanding, the anatomy completely unfamiliar. Klingon physiology was redundant in ways that human medicine found both medically fascinating and deeply inconvenient. Redundant organs, redundant skeletal structure, a ferocious healing factor that fought the surgeon's interventions almost as aggressively as it fought infection. McCoy had managed. McCoy always managed. In the secondary bay, Grace slept. The massive neural strain from the subspace broadcast had pushed her organic architecture to its absolute physical limits, sustaining heavy subspace output through neural pathways that were strictly designed for cognition, not transmission. Her biosigns were currently stable but deeply depressed. She would recover. The synthetic portions of her mind, still dormant since the emergency isolation, showed faint, encouraging signs of reactivation, the microscopic fibers beginning to slowly rebuild the connections that the kill signal had burned and that McCoy's crude intervention had saved. She would wake up. She would undoubtedly be diminished for a time. The heavy fog she had described, the half-lit rooms. But she would wake up. McCoy stood quietly between the 2 beds. The Chancellor of the Klingon Empire and the Cylon woman who had named herself Grace, 2 entirely different people who should never have occupied the same room. Treated by the same doctor, aboard the same ship, in the exact same hour. Hell of a day, McCoy said to absolutely no one in particular. He checked the Chancellor's readings one more time. He gently adjusted Grace's neural monitor. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the sickbay dispenser, replicated, terrible, the only coffee readily available, and sat down heavily in the chair between the beds. He was bone-tired. He was physically sore. His hands still carried the faint phantom tremor from the kill signal crisis 3 days ago, compounded now by the grueling surgery in the battle and the sustained grinding stress of keeping people alive in conditions that Federation medicine was never actually designed for. He drank the terrible coffee. He sat between his patients. He waited. Part 8, USS Enterprise A, bridge. 3 hours later, the neutral zone was perfectly quiet. The debris field had spread to its maximum extent. A thin, glittering cloud of wreckage and cooling plasma that stretched across thousands of kilometers. The silent remains of a base star and 300 raiders marking the exact site of a battle that had permanently changed the quadrant. The Enterprise held station at the field's edge, her exterior running lights casting pale streaks across the heavy hull damage that Scotty's engineering teams were already assessing. Kronos 1 hung securely beside her, battered, heavily scarred, her ventral hull bearing the brutal wounds of 3 heavy raider breaches, but intact. Alive, the Hictor held the outer perimeter with her escort wing. The Yontar was under heavy tow, her impulse engines cold, her weapons permanently sealed, her crew confined to quarters under heavy House Moric guard. Kirk sat in the center seat. The bridge was quiet, just the soft, rhythmic hum of ship systems, the occasional low murmur of status reports, the profound sound of a ship settling into the exhausted calm that always follows a battle. Spock was at the science station, Sulu at the helm, Chekhov at weapons, meticulously running post-engagement diagnostics. Uhura at communications, monitoring the subspace channels with one hand pressed lightly to her earpiece. Scotty's voice came through from engineering. Captain, preliminary damage assessment. The main deflector array is completely destroyed. We'll need a starbase for a full structural rebuild. Hull breaches on decks 4, 7, and 12. All sealed, all stable. Primary shield generators at 41% and holding. Warp drive is functional. Impulse is functional. We can get home, sir. She'll limp, but she'll get there. Thank you, Scotty. Kirk looked at the view screen. The debris field. Kronos 1. The Klingon ships holding the dark. Uhura. Open a channel to Kronos 1. Captain Kavath. Channel open, Captain. Kavath? Captain Kirk. The Klingon's voice was undeniably rough. The heavy sound of a man who had fought in the blood-slicked corridors of his own ship and had not yet stopped to fully process what it had cost him. The Chancellor is stable and resting. McCoy says he'll recover fully. He also says, and I quote, that Klingon anatomy is the most stubbornly redundant system he's ever had the displeasure of repairing, which I'm reliably told is a compliment in Doctor. A long pause. Then a sound Kirk had heard only once before, in a quiet cabin, over wine, on a night that felt like it belonged to a completely different century. Kavath laughed. Captain. When the Chancellor wakes, and he will wake, because he is absolutely the most stubborn man in the Empire, he will want to speak with you. I'll be here. And Captain, the mission, the conference, Khitomer, what about it? It proceeds. The Chancellor was attacked by machines and betrayed by his own general, and he survived it. He will not allow this to end the peace. He will arrive at Khitomer with the scars of this battle literally on his body, and the evidence of the Alliance's strength in his official report to the High Council. Kavath paused, letting the silence hold the weight of his next words. The Alliance held, Captain. Under fire, under boarding, under betrayal, it held. That is the strongest possible argument for peace that any Chancellor has ever carried to a negotiation. Kirk sat in the center seat and felt the absolute weight of that statement settle into his bones. The Alliance held, not in a polished conference room, not through perfectly crafted diplomatic language, in the burning corridors of a Klingon battlecruiser where Federation officers and Klingon warriors had killed machines together and bled together and held the line together because the alternative was entirely unthinkable. Kavath, when this is over, when Khitomer is done and the treaties are signed and the politicians have their moment, I owe you a bottle of wine. You owe me nothing, Captain. We are even. We were never keeping score. No, Kavath said quietly. We were not. The channel closed. Kirk sat on the bridge of the Enterprise, damaged, deeply exhausted, victorious, and looked at the stars. Behind him, in sickbay, a Klingon Chancellor and a woman named Grace slept under the uncompromising care of a doctor who had sworn an oath to do no harm, and who had spent the day relentlessly keeping that oath under conditions that would have broken anyone with less sheer, stubborn devotion to the principle that every life in his care deserved his absolute best. Below him, in engineering, a Scotsman was already rebuilding the ship. Around him, a crew that had fought backwards for 22 minutes. Held the line while their captain boarded a foreign warship, and then turned to face the enemy with everything they had left. Kirk allowed himself exactly 10 seconds. 10 seconds to feel it. The profound relief, the heavy grief, the quiet pride, the bone-deep exhaustion, and beneath all of it, the steady, unshakable certainty that the work was not finished. Khitomer was waiting. The treaties were waiting. The future was waiting. But for 10 seconds, James T. Kirk sat in his chair and breathed. Mr. Sulu, set course for Khitomer. Warp 4. She'll hold.
Aye, Captain. Course laid in.
Engage. The Enterprise turned. Beside her, Kronos 1 turned with her. 2 ships battered and scarred and alive, aligning on the exact same heading, accelerating together toward the place where the peace would be made. Behind them, the debris field cooled in the absolute silence of the neutral zone, marking the exact place where an alliance had been tested and had held. End of Chapter 13. End of Book 1.